Welcome back to the third episode of my Fourth Turning series. Today we will be talking about the four turnings in detail. The first episode I introduced the theory of the cyclum, and the last episode I talked about the history of generations. So with that in mind, let's dive straight into today's episode on the turnings in detail. A turning is an era with a distinct social mood, a new way for people to think about themselves, about their generation, about their collective nation, and the turning comes as a result of the generational constellations that we talked about last episode. A turning begins roughly every 20 years when the generations enter a new phase in life, and like archetypes and constellation, there are four turnings within a cyclum. The first turning is a high. Old prophets disappear, nomads enter elderhood, heroes enter midlife, and artists enter young adulthood. The second turning is an awakening where old nomads disappear and heroes enter elderhood and artists enter midlife and prophets enter childhood. The second turning is an awakening. Old nomads disappear, heroes enter elderhood, artists enter midlife, and prophets enter young adulthood, new nomads are born. The third turning is an unraveling where you guessed it, each generation advances in age, and the fourth turning is the crisis. Like previously discussed, the high is like the spring and the crisis is the winter, with awakenings and unravelings being like the summer and the autumn. An awakening begins when an event triggers an upheaval and revolutions and rising, and a crisis begins when those revolutions have led to conflict and chaos and upheaval. A high begins after the crisis has been resolved, and an unraveling begins after the awakening has been resolved. Again and again, these cycles turn, much like the cycles of entropy, growth, decay, life, rebirth, again and again and again. In the spring, a society strengthens and builds. It's the high, an era of promise and the beginnings of bloom. In an awakening, like in the summer, society plays happily, enjoying the finally blossomed flowers of spring. When an unraveling begins, society harvests and grows melancholy. And in the winter, the crisis, it struggles to survive. Again and again, history turns in this way, and people keep failing to observe this seasonality, failing to observe these patterns of time. Right before the bombardment of Fort Sumter, Lincoln told a story where a king asked his wise men to create a statement that stands always true no matter the time, no matter the generation. And after considerable consideration, the wise men replied, "This too shall pass away." A high brings a renaissance to community life. Society demands order and consensus. Fear of group survival turns into a desire for investment and for growth. Strength. People argue over means rather than ends, and obliging individuals serve a purposeful society where life is friendly and homogeneous. Duty and conformity is rewarded. Gender distinctions are at their highest point. Wars are waged only as a way to solve the remaining echoes of a crisis. Child rearing becomes much more indulgent as people realize that they can relax and settle down. In politics, the Schlesinger-Burham cycles describe a two-stroke altercation where one stroke lasts half a cyclum. We can look at it instead in terms of four, in terms of each turning. Eras of high voter turnout begin near the end of a crisis and run through a high. Meanwhile, low voter turnout and partisan splintering begin near the end of an awakening and run through to the unraveling. Likewise, politics links to foreign affairs, so those follow a pattern as well, what Klingberg called a historical alteration of moods. Extroversions run through a high and unraveling. Introversions run through an awakening and a crisis. During a high, people look beyond American borders and seek to engage in global issues, while during an introversion, people are hesitant and want to focus and sort out their own issues first. Economically, the high and the unraveling are the peak of K-cycles, and the awakening and the crisis are the trough. K-cycles are named after the Russian economist Nikolai Kondratyev, who said that economic cycles are, cyclical. They come in circles. He said that markets are cyclical as during a high, wage and productivity growth is smooth and rapid and it's going up, and during an unraveling, it's also going up and it's accelerating, it's just in a less balanced way. And then On the contrary, during an awakening, it hits one spectacular bust, and during a crisis, it's completely rocked by panic and war. And so we go from this cycle of rapid growth to rapid decline, and then over and over again. In a high, governments play a very important role, and the rules favor the young, and monopolies and trusts and those investments, they're protected. In an unraveling, the public control recedes, while during a crisis, a whole new consensus emerges. In a high, people want to belong, whereas in an awakening, people want to defy. This is why feminism emerged during the awakening. In a high, people are far more likely to feel fairly treated and to be more content with their social roles, no matter their gender distinctions, whereas in an awakening, people start to question the old orders and to realize that things need changing. And a high is also ranked by high birth rates and high trends in crime, because a high is a public consensus. Culturally, it's a bit bland, as there's a lot of agreement and so not a lot of disagreement. The turnings reflect this difference in culture because highs have styles that are functional and romantic, like ballads and musicals and crooners. And they combine confident masculinity and yielding femininity because the core is just to achieve a consensus. Whereas in an awakening, for example, compare that with its shift away from the high with values like gospel and rock and roll and natural motifs and an emergence of fetish-driven lifestyle, whereas an unraveling brings blues and jazz and the most mixing in styles and periods and genders as society begins to narrow their distinctions and blend while at the same time retaining their individuality. And then a crisis finally brings marches and camp songs and interest in rational and classical things and decorum as society sorts itself out. So a high and an unraveling bring the most in terms of literature. Maybe not so much in terms of art or music, but a lot in literature. Consider Shakespeare, consider Milton. The first American high we're looking at is from the period of 1946 to 1964. The lost came of age embittered. They were very hardworking, but they were tired. They partied hard, they worked hard, but they were fearful of poverty and they worshipped success, and they grew old with a low collective self-image because they were underprotected as children and unrewarded as adults. They allowed for the young, the richer, the better, the educated young to take all the jobs, to push past them in this wild rat race, in this competition. They would do the dirty work and they were happy to do it without being rewarded, because those very same youths who gave the 20s the name the Roaring Twenties, after the war were all burnt out, as if a candle was extinguished, and now when they aged, it made it possible for the young to be optimistic and modernizing because the past wasn't holding them back. The lost were this way because they grew up during the war and they were still cautious of the post-war world. So when reforms came forcing people to retire at a younger age, the lost were all too happy to move forward, even if it made them the poorest generation, one of the poorest generations in American history. And they were quite happy to just move over and let the young do their own thing and to get richer and more educated, to have better houses, to have better lifestyles, because after all, the lost were the nomads, the most selfless of all generations. Now let's take a look at the GIs during the high, the hero archetype as they entered midlife. During their childhood, they had been overprotected. Youth clubs, vitamins, pasteurized milk, the prohibition, there was nothing that the older generation wouldn't do to protect the young. The GIs did what they wanted. The Boy Scouts, the American heroes, they brought a no-nonsense attitude to anything that they did. Now, as the hero archetype, they wanted to clear up the world, to fix it, to make it better. They had a harsh, get back in line attitude, let's fix it, let's do it. So if you look at polls of the time, they were far harsher on issues like corporal punishment or talking about foreign intervention. They had far harsher policies, and for them the ideal male role was this like fierce hero, this fierce breadwinner, this fierce protector, and the female as the ideal caretaker, the ideal emotional giver. And during this time, we know that there was Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique, but towards the end there was also The Lost Sex, another popular book that lamented feminism as an illness. The GIs essentially praised the submissive housewife role, and because they believed in doing what they must, they had the most popular figures of their generation were middle-aged cynical comics and interviewers and Hollywood macho men. And during the high, the silent entered young adulthood. This generation was the artists. They all knew who had fought in the big war, and the GIs was their hero attitude attitudes would never let them forget it. They were fine with letting GIs control, with letting GIs take over, and the GIs judged them for not being more entrepreneurial because polls showed that most of them wanted to work for a large corporation rather than start their own business. Withdrawn, cautious, and well, silent. These were the words used to describe this generation. They were pressured by the high era values to quickly settle down, to as soon as you graduate for women to marry off and to have children and for men to pursue the corporate race. And that's what they did, because if you didn't do it, you risked people thinking that you were homosexual or irresponsible. And eventually, young silent women completely disappeared from the workspace. And what ended up happening was that the men joined the race, and they tried to work hard and settle down in corporations, and it paid off because by 20 they were far more educated, by 25 more successful in terms of housing, and by 30 in terms of income far more successful than their parents, than the previous generation. The silent believed in the whole idea that 80% of life is just showing up, and so the income gap shrank. They weren't really given any challenge, nor did they want to invent a challenge for themselves. They didn't suffer from this like mania, this egotistical nature of heroes that were always looking for glory to create challenges for themselves. They wanted a quiet life, and older generations didn't expect much of them, so the silent quickly managed to gather what people wanted from them and simply stuck to their roles. They conformed to their roles. They stuck to views that wouldn't get them sidelined. Movies and culture depicted the youth going crazy from the pressure because of how oppressive this civil discipline was. The silent nonconformists met at coffee houses or swore. I mean, this was the level of nonconformism. They weren't burning down buildings or throwing Molotov cocktails. They were over there reading Howe like Ginsberg did in 1955, or being young bohemians and trying foreign cuisine and listening to jazz. The GIs found this more amusing rather than a threat because, of course, this jazz hippie drinking generation couldn't be there to challenge their roles as the new heroes. And I mean, this is what Ken Casey called the cuckoo bird's nest. Hugh Hefner described the consummate playboy as one who likes jazz, foreign films, Ivy League clothes, gin and tonic, and pretty girls, with an approach to life that is fresh, sophisticated, and yet admittedly sentimental. I mean, look at this description now. It just reads like a well-educated person. Finally, let's look at the boomers entering childhood, the prophets. Recalling their own youth collectivism, wincing at the McCarthy hearings, and worried about bland young adults, LaShan's GI peers wanted to raise children self-focused enough to resist peer pressure and isms of all kinds. Boomer children enjoyed a secure life because people thought that parenting was a career and only 2% were in institutional care. This was the generation that got the most shots in American history. I mean, this was the generation that had advertising begin to target them. No money was spared into their education because of the whole Cold War and the launch of the Sputnik. And so this generation grew up with what the silent didn't have. People targeted them. They created children products, they created Disney merchandise, sitcoms, toys, and what other generations have thought privileges, boomers thought were rights, said Landon Jones. Towards the end of a high, strains began to show. Elder nomads started to impede the heroes' ambitions, and the heroes, now prideful, wanted to lead the world towards more successes, and the artists began tiring of their unfulfilling roles and wanted to take down social barriers. The prophets, indulged by adults, began to sense a dire spiritual void because of the hero's order. A new mood began to emerge, and in 1963 the spark came. Even if Oswald missed, although the specifics might have been different, it was still time for the second turning. An awakening brings a dramatic challenge to the high, as new spiritual movements and social ideas begin to emerge. Soul triumphs over society, and people began to fight the established institutional order. They have trouble feeling like they have a sense of community. Public order deteriorates, crime rates increases, gender distinctions narrow, children are less protected during this period. Eventually, this enthusiasm for rebellion cools with the community shattered and institutions delegitimized. In an awakening, voters tried to disconnect from civic authority, the opposite to what happens to a crisis when people attempt to reach a consensus. The second turning we are looking at is from 1964 to 1984 roughly. After Kennedy's assassination, America shook as a society, and people began to instead look to issues of dissent rather than issues of agreement. The future promised material abundance, and so beneath all this change and rebellion lay the assumption that no matter the frustration and passion, the foundation was solid and the institutions and the values would hold. The awakening was made possible by this confidence, by this assumption, but the era eroded it. The erosion of confidence began in 1964, signaled by 3 apocalyptic films, 7 Days in May, Failsafe, Dr. Strangelove, that indicated the highest trust in authority, government, and technology. The new mindset was that social authority brought too many issues, that corporations crushed individualism, academia smothered creativity, parents ruined children's psyche, and that the police were oppressive. This period brought questioning, doubt, frustration, crisis, extremist politics, escapism, violence, destruction, counter-violence, racial tension. 1969 was the year of the Vietnam War, and maybe that failure would have been fine during the high, but not during an awakening. It acted as a symbol. It showed that maybe our society is not strong enough to deal with issues from abroad after all. By now, memories of the last crisis are buffered by the highest calm and comfort, so the core values are seen as outdated, unnecessary. The awakening years are memorable for their images of contrasting extremes, the triumph of power, wealth, and knowledge side by side with the passionate outcry of the spirit. Think of Cardinal Wolsey ruling over his palaces while the people sought to learn more of Luther's reformations. Think of Francis Bacon completing his work while people struggled to believe in the Protestant promise of salvation. During the awakening, the heroes enter into elderhood, the artists into midlife, the prophets into young adults. The heroes replace the nomads and they make grand secular plans, setting the stage for the spiritual goals of the young. The age of the heroes doesn't slow their energy, instead it encourages them. Even when they lose battles against new values, they still have institutional power and they're associated with optimism, teamwork, civil trust. And meanwhile, the artists are caught in the outer missions of the old heroes and the younger missions of the young prophets, and artists act as mediators. They mentor the youth movements, they help sensitize the elders' work. They compensate for their conformism by participating in high-risk behavior. As the self-absorbed prophets replace the artists, they seek spiritual awakenings and take for granted the comforts of secular life as they encourage a strong inner life. Nomads are left underprotected at this time of self-discovery and acquire cynicism because they're expected to grow up fast and be independent. But the adults see these qualities as negative and they become a metaphor for society's new pessimism. In the GI's elder years, even as the nation celebrated them for their victorious efforts in World War II, they didn't have a prominent position in culture. They were more like the financial backstops, their representations of affluence. They continued with those roles. They gave money to the boomers, but the boomers didn't ask them for advice, and where the GIs respected their parents, the boomers didn't really respect them, and so the GIs lamented this loss of a sense of community. Meanwhile, the silent watched over all this. They reached out to people of all cultures, races, incomes, ages, disabilities, and this helped produce good generations of, artists, songwriters, authors, therapists. The sexual revolution of the awakening brought silent men to feel claustrophobic in their marriages and women resentful, and as the silent had their way in legislature, the number of no-fault divorce legislations increased. The result was a mix of silent men who had GI confidence and boomer sensitivity. They acted as the mediators. Many became the first openly gay politicians, and they just wished that somebody would let me be what I am. Tender, sometimes independent too, but also vain and greedy and jealous and competitive. Silent feminists now began to feel resentment over allowing themselves to be sidelined and pushed into the home while their male counterparts pursued opportunities. The gender roles that the GIs valued and were so happy with began to fall apart. People began to switch spouses, change careers. The silent felt like Bob Dylan that, but I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. Meanwhile, the boomers were entering young adulthood along with a fanfare of violence. The clenched fist was their emblem, the campus unrest soared. Boomers lacked civic instincts as the older presidential candidates saw them because they lost and gained support easily. Entry-level jobs began difficult to find, and the euphoria of the early awakening eventually began to fade away. The boomers were incredibly self-absorbed, and this lent their generation a hermaphroditic equality because they set out to narrow gender role distinctions, while men became mothers and teachers and women became careerists, which made them more independent of social roles, but also more open to economic insecurity. When the awakening began to calm down, the boomers were very quick to change up their values of before and suddenly be interested in consumption and careers and families. And other generations saw them as hypocrites for their pick and choose, but the boomers were too self-absorbed to care. And the 13ers entering childhood, meanwhile, struggled amid a world where children were no longer valued. And think of Rosemary's Baby, a thriller about a woman pregnant with an evil demon, or movies like The Exorcist. Think of books like Lord of the Flies or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which shows children as brats. I mean, Hollywood made fewer movies for children, rather they made it for people about children. The awakening with its non-traditionality left an imprint on the 13ers, because especially the silent being overprotected, they were quick to prepare their children for the world, to give them independence, to grant them a chance to see life for themselves. And so the older generations were often shocked to see kids walk around and talk the talk and know everything because they have been exposed to it from so young an age. New realism emerged as a genre, so children would be told about abortion or child abuse, other issues previous generations just didn't learn from. And so increasingly it began to seem to children that those issues that other generations were protected from as children, they weren't protected from them, and so they began to see other generations as just not being in control. Standards were weakened, people spent less time on homework, grade inflation was rampant. Now being a good adult meant giving participation stickers, and the number of teen mothers rose and foster care began to collapse. The title of America's Most Poor Generation went straight from the lost to the 13ers. This poverty skipped the generations in between, and if you ask many 13ers how they were raised, they would say that they raised themselves. Because indeed that was the case. Apart from a happy smiley face sticker, there was not much reassurance given to them about the state of the world. And towards the end of the awakening, the strains began to show. The outer heroes vacated the culture sphere and were concerned about this newfound spiritualism. The midlife artists sensed the loss of an old order and planned to cast off community discipline and make public choice a bigger option. The young adult prophets were inspired by their discovery of personal truth, wanted to change society. The cynical nomads grew up learning adults could not be trusted. They were prepared to make their own way, and by the 80s, all the generations were now prepared for a change, for a new direction. Their previous social roles could not continue. Unraveling begins as a society embraces the new, liberating cultural forces set loose by the awakening. People are content with their spiritual rebirth, their individuality, so they begin to assert the pragmatism, self-reliance, chauvinism, public safety. Public trust begins to ebb, harsh debates take over, principled individuality reach their peak, gender differences get their narrowest point, children become more protected. The arguments are now over ends rather than means. Community problems are deferred, people struggle to reach a consensus. Society serves individuals and the sense of community disappears, and think of the pop culture of the Terminator and the punishment and the doomsday prognosis for the future. People become increasingly more cynical. Civic attitudes become the opposite of what they were in a high. Now the economy is one of scarcity with a psychology of abundance, the exact opposite of the previous one, and public trust sinks. Only 1 in 5 Americans believe that the president or Congress can be counted on. People trusted the individual, and this was expressed through the marketplace, cultural diversity, interactive technologies, new age spirituality, evangelicalism. The old focus on policies and programs had receded, but the public vacuum was gradually being filled by a new politics of personal rootedness, inner values, empathetic gesture. Institutions become worse at meeting community needs. Post the Simpson trial, people began to see the system as more of a system rather than a bringer of justice. In 1984, the electorate backed an economic policy of large deficits and unchecked growth in entitlement spending, and a decade later, fiscal excess was a norm, and multiculturalism spread, and America became a quilt that Jesse Jackson declared to be a rag of splitting strands. The sense of community drifted apart, not only a sense of belonging ethnically, but family-wise. The conventional cereal packet family was no longer the norm, teen pregnancies less of a rarity, and Hollywood invented the violent action movie at which point the average child has seen tens and thousands of TV mayhem by the age of 18 and the death by gunfire tripled. By the mid-1990s, amid an extended economic boom, 3 in 4 adults believed the United States to be in moral and spiritual decline. The 1987 stock crash, the Wall Street scandals, the Cold War, the Desert Storm. All this produced a disquieting new world, and the collapse of healthcare confirmed that institutions could no longer handle it. The Simpson trials, the bombings, with every jolt yet another part of the old order fell apart. The 90s generated good news too. By all means, the economy improved, the stock market roared, school achievements were going up, crime rates down, but Americans were more pessimistic than ever, inclined to believe that good news came with bad news. This new declinism has become unshakable. The departure of 13ers from childhood leaves people of all ages, themselves included, wondering what went wrong there. New millennial babies are being born. America is moving into an archetypal constellation that is reaching an apogee of inner private power and a nadir of outer public. And unraveling gives people the chance to seek life to the fullest, to be selfish, to consume the past, to pursue individual ends. Human civilization would be worse off without such a chance, and it's a necessary phase because it empowers the ideals of the awakening and it lays the foundation for a crisis. All the 7 turnings we have observed in history followed a similar passage of entropy and disintegration. The new priority is to atomize, not gather, to harvest, not sow. Informal entities revitalize as large ones weaken. People disdain consensus, welcome conflict. Contrasts grow more pronounced. Society fragments, the pace of life quickens. Artists enter elderhood, prophets midlife, nomads come of age, heroes are born. Artists quicken the pace of social change and accept social forces. As prophets replace artists, they preach a downbeat, value-fixated ethic with a sober severity. They begin to reshape institutions from the inside. They come to political power slowly. Splits began to emerge between factions as people see them as ineffective hypocrites and compete. Alienated nomads replace prophets in young adulthood and become free agents, giving pragmatism and independence, and nomads come of age in a society of weak structure. They feel little sense of collective purpose, they have all the necessary skills for survival. They begin to sort themselves out into winners and losers. They simply do what they must. Heroes replace nomads in childhood, extremely protected, extremely nurtured, taught to be obedient achievers, team players. Millennials are raised to be heroes. There's a boom in appreciating children. When millennials reached elementary school, children's issues were at the top of their agenda. The 1990s became what Mario Cuomo called the decade of the child. Millennials came to personify America's age of unraveling rediscovery of moral standards and spiritualism. Parents let millennials live longer in childhood, reversing the hustle of the previous awakening. TV shows like Barney, with its saccharine sweetness, teach millennials that everything will be okay. They're not raised to explore the inner world, but rather the outer. The book predicted that the well-being of the millennials will become a focal point for America's civic culture. Organized public places, athletic stadia, cinemas, parks, malls will be newly segmented, isolating kid-friendly havens from coarser fare elsewhere. The internet will start teaching netiquette and will help parents shield adolescents from chat rooms with misbehaving adults. Hollywood will make movies about wholesome teenagers doing good things for their communities. Suggestive teen ads and magazines will draw adult condemnation as boomers aggressively scrutinize and chaperone the teen culture. Towards the OOs, the mood will be far more jittery, wrote the author. The years of the reality checks and acknowledging the individual empowerment has led to antisociality and the decay of public institutions. People will start rooting for something big while political parties promise them that everything is just like before, everything is going great. Institutions will serve hyper-complex purposes, but seem empty on the inside, like a shell of what they used to be. People will realize that they're living on a flimsy foundation and wonder at what it felt like to live in a community. The silent will be deeply anguished. Boomers will think over their institutional powerlessness. The 13ers will find ways of controlling small things. The millennials will come of age as embodiments of hope. Boomers will not want to behave like their elders. 13ers don't want to be judgmental. Millennials will not want to be so cynical. The artists will now impede the prophets' values. The prophets will grow impatient to lead society towards spiritualism. Nomads will want to settle down. Child heroes will begin to sense a secular challenge. Towards the early OOs, the public mood will feel stale. Society will be ready for a shock. A crisis arises because of a sudden threat, and the only way to defeat it is to make society prevail, so people support public authority, community obstacles are removed, laws and customs resisting change are finally changed. People begin to feel shamed about their previous behavior, and punishment becomes more severe. Risk-taking disappears, crime declines, families strengthen, gender distinctions widen, children are overprotected. Wars are fought with fury for maximum result, and the mood transforms into one of exhaustion and relief as people begin to hope for good and simple things. All these happy wishes of somewhere over the rainbow as happiness are conditioned on a victory in a crisis, and that victory demands unity and sacrifice, and society fights to survive the winter. In a crisis, anything that is not lashed down goes flying, and anything in the way gets rolled over. The climax gathers energy from unmet needs and unresolved issues, and that energy is then spent on an upheaval, shaking and transforming society. It can be a triumph or a tragedy. Empires are forged or destroyed. One chapter of history ends with another start. A crisis catalyst happens after the old prophet archetype reaches its peak, and it's no longer checked by others. The regeneracy comes when the prophet abandons ideas of deferral or retreat. A climax when the prophet spends its last burst of passion. The resolution comes when the nomad asserts full control with the prophet's symbolic assistance. Prophets are led by their passion and principle. They seek obedience from the young, and they offer reward and opportunity for heroism. Pragmatic nomads apply toughness to protect society and to protect the young. They become cautious and the ablest emerge as pragmatic public leaders, and they rise to the occasion making the necessary choices, but the prophets are quick to judge and slow to give praise, and team-working heroes in adulthood challenge the political failures of elder-led crusades and fuel secular crisis. They provide a turning point. As artists replace the heroes in childhood, they're overprotected at a time of political convulsion and adult self-sacrifice. The fourth turning made a series of predictions as to what sparks the crisis. As you can see, they were largely very accurate. Anger at mistakes will be made into calls for action regardless of the risk. Institutions will become more controlling, limiting personal freedom. Criminal justice will be swift. The climax will roughly be 25 years after the beginning. The climax could be anything from economic distress to social to cultural, technological, ecological, political, military. Decisive events will occur, and we will go through ekpyrosis once more. It will be total war, if there is a war, with the most destructive weapons put into use, and global order will shift. If the crisis catalyst comes on schedule around the year 2005, then the climax will be due around 2020, the resolution around 2026. Shifted a few years later, and let's see how accurate this is. I have mentioned before that we will look at the fourth turning in far more detail after the author's new book will come out specifically on it. I would like to end this video with the tips the authors have left on surviving the crisis: to participate in seasonal activities by taking advantage of the current turning, to avoid post-seasonal behavior by terminating habits that were appropriate for the prior turning but not for the current one, to make pre-seasonal preparations by trying to anticipate the needs and opportunities of the next turning. That was for the nation, whereas for the individual, it's to rectify, to return to classical values of honor, integrity, to converge and to heal your community, to bond and to build personal relationships, to prepare your family for order, to look to them for support, to brace yourself for the crisis economically and spiritually. Think of it like a blizzard and ensure you have what you need for many years. It is us who will see the fourth turning in its full historical context. It is us who will craft the great myths and legends around what happens in this coming of trial. Remember, forewarned is forearmed. Thank you.